If you've been around this channel for long, you know that Gales of Nayeli is one of my most anticipated games this year. It's an indie strategy RPG by BlindCoco Studios, and ever since I tried a demo of it almost a year ago, I have been psyched to get my hands on it again. Well, the game officially comes out today, but BlindCoco was kind enough to give me early access to the first couple dozen chapters of the game, and I'm pleased to say that the game lives up to my high expectations. If you're an srpg fan, especially if you're a Fire Emblem fan, I think this is a game you're going to want to play, so let's talk about it. Gales of Nayeli follows the titular Nayeli as she begins a continent-spanning journey to prevent a catastrophe that she foresaw in a vision. Along the way, she'll make new allies and enemies as she defends towns and storms castles. I don't want to get too much into the details of the story as I want you to go play it for yourself. I'll touch a bit more on some of the writing stuff later, but for now, let's talk about the gameplay. Gales of Nayeli takes obvious inspiration from Fire Emblem and really nicely blends some older Fire Emblem sensibilities with some of the cooler features from modern Fire Emblem games, while putting a unique spin on the whole thing. One of the biggest strengths of the game is that so many options, from classes to weapons to characters, feel distinct and interesting, but the game doesn't sacrifice player expression to achieve this. Let's look at a few units that I think illustrate this really well. The first thing you're going to do when you start the game is make an avatar, and you're going to pick for them a class, a good stat, and a body type and pronouns. And they're actually one of my favorite units to use. During the original demo, I tried out every class for the avatar, but in this playthrough I picked Mage, which you'll notice pretty immediately works a little differently than Mage is in most srpgs, and it's a good example of how characters in Gales of Nayeli can be unique and how that uniqueness benefits the gameplay. The big thing that the Mage avatar gets is a special action called Focus. On any turn, you can choose to focus, which ends your turn much like the wait command, while buffing your next magic attack. You can focus up to 3 times in a row, and if you do so, your eventual attack will automatically double and get a nice damage boost. Perfect for killing bosses or difficult enemies. Or just a good way to fill a turn if you have an empty turn on your Mage avatar. What I really like about this mechanic though is how it plays on maps with some objective that's under time pressure. Chapter 3, for example, is a defense map with a huge armored enemy in the top right corner, and objectives in every direction. One good way to kill that big armored enemy is simply focusing 3 times and then blasting him away with a supercharged magic attack. But doing so means your mage has to take 3 turns off of fighting to focus. During that time they can't defend or push towards any of the side objectives. In my playthrough, using focus this way made killing armored enemies easy, but not being able to use my mage to push towards the other objective meant that I missed a chest. On maps like these, focus does more than just make mages feel different than other classes, it provides meaningful decision points that impact your strategy. When can you afford to focus, and when is it better to just attack? And a lot of units in Gales of Nayeli have little abilities or skills like this that both make the unit feel more unique, and also present interesting strategic decisions. Some of these will feel familiar to Fire Emblem fans, such as movement skills like shove and reposition, while others are more unique, like Enchant, a skill that Miles the Enchanter can use to give a unit increased damage and allow them to deal magic damage instead of physical damage for a turn. There's so many applications for this, from using it to help a physical unit kill an armored unit with low resistance, to using it on your low-level trainee chicken Remington to help him do more than 1 damage per attack. Sometimes though, you might even just prefer Miles' attack on his own, especially since Enchant has a cooldown after you use it. The cooldown on Enchant, as well as the loss of Miles' own attack to use it, makes when to use Enchant and who to use it on interesting strategic questions. And since Miles is the only one who can enchant when you get him, whether you choose to deploy him for his buff, or to deploy a unit with better combat is an interesting strategic question that's opened up. It's also a way for players to express themselves. What units you choose to bring with you and how you choose to use their abilities has a major impact on how every map plays out, and since there's no reclassing, and even units in similar classes often have different skills, units feel like more than just their stats and their class. You'll often get units that have some overlap in role, but have important differences that ensure they each have a niche. Our early game archer, Curtis, gets buffed when he attacks alone, and has movement skills that let him get around allies and enemies. He's great for picking off lone enemies or just providing the extra damage you need at long range, and his mobility skill makes him a little more self-sufficient. Cleo is a harpy that we get later on that can also use bows, but trades Curtis's higher strength and personal mobility skill for flight, access to one range in the form of talons, and a reposition skill that lets her move other units around instead of herself. Despite seeming somewhat similar to Curtis at a surface level, I end up using these units for pretty different things. Curtis when I just want big damage, and Cleo when I think flight, or the ability to move around my allies is going to be helpful, or if I think lack of one range is going to be an issue for the part of the map I want to send my archer to. Once I had enough units that I needed to start benching some, I found it to be a very difficult choice, not just because I liked all of the characters, but also because at least so far, the cast doesn't feel like it has any clunkers. Each unit has a clear role and selling point, and their exact function often feels difficult for other units to replicate. This becomes a little less true as you get more and more units and roles start to overlap a bit more, but in general units feel distinct, which lets players express themselves through how they combine the tools that they're given. I suspect this is going to make replaying the game pretty fun. Using a different avatar or a selection of different units feels like it could completely shift the way you approach certain maps. For example, one of my favorite combinations of units is Carrie, a dagger-using unit who hits for low damage but up to 6 times per turn, with Miles' Enchant ability. Particularly against bulky units, Carrie can sometimes struggle, but when enchanted, each of her attacks benefits from the magical damage buff that Miles provides, allowing her to decimate units that are difficult for other units in your army to one-round. Combining abilities like this is something that I did a lot in Gales of Nayeli, and it made me feel pretty clever when it worked out. Figuring out these combinations doesn't necessarily feel like it trivializes the game either, since there's often limitations to them. Miles and Carrie may be able to kill an enemy, but Enchant only lasts 1 turn and you can't use it 2 turns in a row. So instead of feeling like an overpowered combination that solves all your problems, enchanting Carrie feels more like a tool that you can break out to deal with tricky enemies, and I think that's awesome. I feel similarly about the Mage's focus ability. It has pretty clear and obvious applications, but the restriction that you have to charge it up to get the best use out of it means that you won't just use it to decimate the game. And I think there's units in Gales of Nayeli for all types of players. A unit like Carrie, who's highly mobile but requires the use of other tools like Miles' Enchant to maximize her potential, is really fun for me. But if you don't like having to put as much work into your unit performing, there's also units like Queedle, Sharief, and Leela, who are good in a much more straightforward way of just hitting hard all the time. Encouraging player expression through unique tools feels like a big part of the ethos of Gales of Nayeli, and beyond the units, this also applies to weapons and skills and combat arts as well. Magic is a great example of this. Most magic weapons in this game can't double attack, and there's a strong emphasis on weapons having different effects, not just different damage stats. The Ember spell is effective against bugs, Wind magic can strike from 3 range using a combat art, the Pebble spell deals physical damage and increases the user's defense, and Chill is a low might spell that lowers your physical defense but allows for doubling. Weapons having different effects or stat bonuses that set them apart rather than just dealing more or less damage is a trend for the game, and while some weapons definitely feel more useful than others to me, almost all of them feel like they have their place, and even items you might not think are compelling at first, you might find yourself using more often than you think. Our main character, Nayeli, starts the game with a wooden spear and a wind spear. The wind spear seems much more exciting. It can attack at 2 range, it has more might, and it's effective against flyers. However, it can't double at 2 range, and it lowers your defense and resistance by 2 when you use it. So sometimes you just want to use the old reliable wooden spear at 1 range, especially if Nayeli is going to be fighting more than a couple units at once. This design pattern holds true for a lot of the game's 2-range weapons. Most of them don't double, and when they do, they tend to have low might. I really like this as a design decision. 2-range weapons are absolutely still useful in this game, in fact I use them all the time, but there's a clear offensive advantage for fighting at 1 range versus a clear defensive advantage for fighting at 2 range. This seems pretty obvious, but if you've played a lot of srpgs, you know it's really easy to fall into the trap where either 1 to 2 range is strong enough to outshine 1 range options, or for 2 range to just not feel very good to use. Gales of Nayeli strikes a good balance here. Designing 1 to 2 range weapons in this way also allows bows to shine in Gales of Nayeli, as unlike 1 to 2 range weapons, most bows can double and often have high might. So there's a good reason to use every weapon type. 1 range weapons are great if a unit is going to be enemy phasing, 1 to 2 range weapons offer flexibility at the cost of weaker offense, and bows provide longer range than other weapons without sacrificing offense, at the expense of not being able to fight 1 range enemies on enemy phase. The game also makes good use of PRF weapons, which are weapons that only a specific unit can use, to give some units just a little extra sauce. My favorite is Sharief's Great Spear, which provides a massive base might of 16 while also granting him +2 defense and resistance. It's a great weapon for him because it really leans into his role. He's a tank, and the lance makes him even tankier while still allowing him to deal respectable damage and even one-shot squishier enemies despite not being able to double because of his low speed. And making it a PRF weapon ensures that it does what it's supposed to do, makes Sharief even better at his role, rather than letting you give it to a faster unit to make them both a bulky and offensive powerhouse. Since you get the spear on a defense map right next to a choke point, it also helps Sharief be immediately useful and make a good first impression. The Great Spear is also a cool PRF weapon because you actually get to choose whether you get it or not. Sharief joins in Chapter 3 alongside his friend Flynn. There's a village right above them, and if you visit it with Sharief, you get his Great Spear, while if you visit it with Flynn, he gets a different PRF. The weapons are pretty cool in this game. It does have a durability system, so if you use weapons too much or use combat arts with them a lot, they can break and then you can't use them anymore. However, the game does also offer an item that repairs weapons, and while it is a consumable, there are a lot of them. The result is that durability does matter somewhat. If you want to use a weapon a lot, you can't just use the most expensive in terms of durability combat arts all the time. But you also don't need to be afraid of using your cool weapons because you can always repair them. You're not going to lose them forever. The last couple things that define a unit are their skills and combat arts, with each unit having their own set of each. Some you'll see reused from character to character. Many characters, for example, have leftover move use, which allows you to move again after many actions if you have remaining movement left, very similar to Kanto in Fire Emblem. But each character also has their own unique skills, which often pull double duty in providing a mechanical identity for each unit while also helping convey their personality to the player. Daisy is a good example of this. Her skill Eager Guardian gives allies around her a defensive boost, which is a great tool and a reason you might choose to use her over another staffer. But it also speaks to her character. Daisy is protective of her friends. In the story, we see that manifested in her wariness around strangers that she thinks might harm the group, such as the Avatar. And in gameplay, we see that represented in her defensive aura. I'm a real sucker for this sort of thing. It makes on-map gameplay and story sections feel much more harmonious and makes me feel like I'm fighting with characters, not just chess pieces with different portraits. And beyond personal skills, sometimes you'll even find skill scrolls that let you give a unit a skill, so there's some room for customization here too. Combat arts, which are special attacks that you can use at the cost of spending some extra weapon durability, play a similar role. A great example being Gallant, an experienced knight who can help pass on some of that experience with his veteran spike skill. It's a strong and accurate attack, but crucially one that cannot kill an enemy, meaning you can use him to set up kills for any of your training projects. This gives him a nice mechanical niche while also telling us something about the character. Awesome. Alright, that's enough gushing about units because let's be honest, as good as the units may be, all of those interesting features can be null and void if the maps don't complement them. Fortunately, Gales of Nayeli does not disappoint. Maps include tons of varied unit types so you can make use of all those different effective weapons the game gives you. The game also mixes in weapon types and methods of movement from enemies. Lots of groups of physical enemies will have a magic enemy or a dagger enemy that can ignore defense mixed in, so you can't just solve all of your problems with a high defense unit. Flyers on defense maps discourage you from just choking points, and the game often includes objectives that reward the player if they are able to accomplish things quickly without punishing you too hard if you don't. Often this is in the form of treasure chests or droppable items, but things like green units to protect are often used too. These objectives often don't result in a game over, but provide an incentive for the player to come up with strategies to get them, while giving them the option not to if they're having a harder time. I'm doing my playthrough on the highest difficulty, and there were a number of maps where I elected to skip a side objective to make a map a little easier to complete, and I think that's a decent sign of the game's difficulty being in a pretty good spot. And each time I complete a map without getting all of the side objectives, I know that that's an area for me to improve on next time I try the map. Something else I really like about the chapters in Gales of Nayeli is the diversity of map objectives. Of course, you have more typical ones like kill all enemies or defeat boss, but there's some more inventive or unusual ones. There's a string of maps early in the game that goes kill all enemies while protecting these chickens, then defend this town, then seize this castle and then kill a boss, and then escort this green unit through a winding map. The objective variety was something I really appreciated, and it gave each map a little hook that made them that much more memorable. If the chicken map had just been a generic route map, I probably wouldn't remember it too well, but since it's instead the chicken map, it's ingrained into my mind forever. So all in all, I thought the on-map gameplay was pretty good, and the game even offers modifiers for people that want to do challenge runs or play in a different way than the game was built. You can add a weapon triangle, turn on fixed growths if you don't like random stats, set growths to 0% for a challenging run, or set growths to 100% for either an easier time or just to see how units could perform at their maximum potential. Of course, a game is more than just its on-map mechanics, and I'm pretty fond of the story so far too. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the events of the story as I want you to play it and experience it for yourself, but I do want to talk about how the story is structured and how it complements the gameplay. Strategy RPG fans won't be shocked by the core flow of the story. Between each map, you have cutscenes that take you from one map to the next, and during these segments you can have support conversations between your units that flesh out their relationships. But Gales of Nayeli adds a few things that I like. One is that many support conversations end with very tangible effects on the game. If a character has a support where they experience major growth or learn something new, that is often reflected by them gaining a skill that helps them in battle. If a support has one character giving another one an item, they often get that item added to their inventory. In a lot of my videos, I talk about how I like when the gameplay of srpgs really supports the story, but I don't talk as much about how games can do the opposite, and this is a great example. Using the skill you learned from a support, or an item you got from one, makes the support relationship feel that much more valuable. And it allows you to feel the contributions of a unit even after you benched them if they provided a unit you haven't benched with a useful skill or item. Gales of Nayeli also includes a little bit of player choice in the support system in two major ways. First, sometimes Nayeli will have a mutually exclusive support option. Early in the game, for example, you have a chance to have Nayeli speak with either Queedle or Carrie, so you have to decide which of those relationships is more important to you in that moment. Additionally, the game does feature romance. Not every character can romance everyone, but most characters have at least a couple romance options. What I like about this system is that each romantic support has a separate platonic version, so if you decide you want to have Carrie romance Nayeli, she doesn't have to awkwardly stop supporting Miles. Instead, they can have an entirely separate platonic ending to their support, which I appreciate. Supports also aren't uniform in length. Some supports have as many as 5 conversations, while others have just 2 or 3. So relationships that are more prominent get all the time they need to flourish, while less important relationships still have an opportunity to develop, just not quite as much as those other ones. The last thing I want to touch on is the art and character designs. The presentation of Gales of Nayeli is very charming, especially the over-the-top crit animations that remind me of GBA-era Fire Emblem. But one of the things that drew me to Gales of Nayeli initially was the huge variety in the designs of the characters. Among the human portion of the cast, Gales of Nayeli includes a pretty diverse set of characters, which is something I really appreciate coming from Fire Emblem, which can be lacking in that area. This extends to the writing too, with the game including a variety of LGBT characters. God bless BlindCoco for letting me ship Leela and Cleo, as is my God-given right. Every character pops in this game, and I think people will have no problem finding a character that speaks to them. If you're not as interested in the human characters, that's okay too, because the game still has plenty to offer, from bow-wielding harpies to the game's trainee, Remington, the most noble of chickens. Gales of Nayeli has been a game I've been looking forward to a very long time, and I'm pleased to say that as far as I'm concerned, it's delivered. The game is out today, and I can't wait to finish up the rest of it. Realistically, by the time this video comes out, I'm probably already playing it. If you're a Fire Emblem fan, I really think you should check this one out. You'll find a link in the video description. One last thing, BlindCoco actually put an item in the game for many YouTubers that did videos on the demo of Gales of Nayeli. This did not impact my desire to cover the game, as I didn't find out about this until I had already made multiple streams and a video on the game. But I bring this up to tell you to make sure you explore Chapter 6 thoroughly, because there might be a little surprise for you. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so you never miss an upload, and a big shout out to my super skinks, Lonely Voxel and the Noodle Doodler, along with my other skinks, Marms, Shake Her Hand, Nepsit, Muted Miami, Doopy, Stars to Art, Wingman, Upscale Furry Trashed, Lonely Voxel, Cosplay Sylveon, Aikipoo, Lucy Sev, Emma, Aaron Gedden, Red Mage Morgan, N6, and Punch Fighter Champion. If you want to support the channel, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the video description. Thanks for hanging out until the end of the video, and I hope you have yourself a lovely week.